Begin. My name is René van Sloten, and I'm an Executive Director for Industrial Policy at the European Chemical Industry Council, CEFIC. I'd like to start with some general remarks. The European chemical industry supports the European Green Deal and Europe's ambition to become climate neutral in 2050. Our industry will play a critical role in Europe's transition, but also will need to undergo a massive transformation of technologies, processes, business models, to name a few. The past few unprecedented months have underscored the need for investment in this transformation. For companies to continue investing in Europe and in cleaner technologies, they need assurance that their competitiveness on the EU market will be preserved. That means that EU environmental law should be strictly enforced. No product that does not comply with EU rules will be imported into the bloc. The fight against illegal trade in HFC refrigerants gases is crucial, not only for achieving Europe's 2050 ambition, but also in the fight against organized crime. Throughout the webinar, participants will hear some significant findings following research from data analytics consultancy Oxera. Now, being in CEFIC for a long time, for over 30 years, this story is a repeat of the illegal import of CFCs in the 1990s. But I would hasten to stress, with a notable difference this time, that the Commission and also Olaf have been quick to react to the signals from industry. We are pleased to see that better enforcement has been recognized as a pillar of the long-term action plan for better implementation and enforcement of single market rules, and that a strong package of actions to address the lack of enforcement will be implemented. Better enforcement is one of the pillars of the upcoming chemical strategy for sustainability, and we especially look forward to the use of digital solutions and tools to detect and tackle non-compliant products entering the EU markets. We are here at the start of an important journey, and we thank you for joining us and supporting these efforts. I would now like to introduce our three speakers. First of all, Tim Fink, who's the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Honeywell and Vice Chair of EFCTC. The EFCTC is a sector group of CEFIC and represents the European fluorocarbon producers. The EFCTC is represented by the companies Arkema, Chemours, Daikin Chemical, Honeywell, and Cura. Second speaker is Dr. Nicole Rosenboom. She's a senior consultant at Oxera Consulting. Nicole specializes in competition economics and has a PhD in economics from the University of Amsterdam, focusing on cartels. Prior to joining Oxera, Nicole worked for 8 years as a senior competition researcher for a Dutch consultancy firm. Last but not least, Murli Sukhwani is a region director of fluorochemicals at the Chemours company and chair of the EFCTC Data and Investigations Working Group. Murli spent his whole life in the chemistry industry, for the large part at DuPont, which became Chemours. I would now like to hand over to Tim Fink, who will introduce the F-gas regulation and the issue of illegally imported HFCs. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, René, for your kind introduction. May I say a warm welcome to all of you on today's World Refrigeration Day. I know that many of you joining this call are working with HFCs and are familiar with it. But for those who are not familiar with it, HFCs are a group of gases used predominantly in refrigeration, air conditioning applications, but also foam blowing, aerosols, fire protection, and as solvents. They were developed as alternatives to chlorofluorocarbons, ozone-depleting substances that have been phased out since the early 90s under the Montreal Protocol. As I said, one of the key applications of HFCs is in refrigeration and air conditioning systems, especially in supermarkets, office buildings, hotels, shopping centers, and hospitals. HFCs provide the same benefits as CFCs in terms of energy efficiency, safety, and cost effectiveness. However, on average, they have a high global warming potential, much higher than CO2, and only slightly less than CFCs, which are also very potent greenhouse gases. Therefore, the EU is gradually phasing down HFC use to limit the climate change impact. Through a quota system set up in the F-gas regulation, which entered into force in 2015. The phase down is managed with quotas that promote a gradual shift to lower global warming potential alternatives, with in the end a 79% reduction of HFC consumption by global warming potential in 2030. EFCTC member companies and the value chain have already invested time and efforts towards developing alternatives which have much lower global warming potential. Some equipment, for example, car air conditioning systems, have been using alternatives, including hydrofluoroolefins, in Europe since 2013. Others, such as industrial and commercial cooling systems, will take much longer to adapt because of the relatively long equipment lifespan and the very large installed base. Throwing out well-functioning equipment also doesn't help progress towards climate goals. Replacing HFCs is equipment specific, and that is why the managed phase down is so important. I'll turn to the black market now. So as soon as the effects of the substantial reduction under the regulation became apparent in 2018, a black market for refrigerants started emerging. They are brought into Europe outside of the defined quotas set in the regulation. And once criminal organizations have managed to get them in, they enter sometimes the legitimate supply chain. Companies of all sizes all over Europe could therefore potentially be using illegally imported HFCs to refill cooling installations, car air conditioning systems, etc. These gases are imported through various methods and are readily available, unfortunately. This is mainly due to a lack of awareness at national level and also inconsistent and unharmonized enforcement of the regulation. Low fines and discrepancies between member states in respect of penalties are not helping either, as is the lack of coordination and sharing of data between public entities and agencies. To address this issue, EFCTC member companies agreed on a comprehensive set of actions, and this webinar is part of our efforts. The most frequently used routes we and our investigative agency, Kroll, have identified are abuse of what we call the T1 transit procedure under customs regulations, straight smuggling, and e-commerce platforms. This black market has had a very corrosive effect on the legitimate supply chain, which consists of thousands of small and medium-sized operators who've made substantial investments into the transition to low global warming potential alternatives, the responsible recovery and recycling and reclamation of HFCs. As a result, many small and medium-sized enterprises have seen a dramatic drop in their business. Therefore, for them, it's really existential. It's also detrimental to the European Union's climate objectives. Out of quota F-gases means that the transition to low global warming potential alternatives is put into jeopardy. As we're all working towards the renewed ambition of the Green Deal, it's particularly important to look at issues related to the internal market and the enforcement of regulations. And finally, illegal trade is funding organized crime. Criminal organizations simply do not report their transactions in the official system, and they operate through various levels of middlemen, and therefore it's very difficult to identify who's behind it. Therefore, it has been very difficult to determine the size of the black market, and in order to shed light on the issue, EFCTC commissioned an independent expert to examine the HFC trade flows into the European Union and countries neighboring the Union. And I'm very pleased that Nicole Rosenbaum is joining us from Axera, and she will present the findings today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm glad to be here. My name is Nicole Rosenbaum. I work at Axera. We are an independent consultancy with offices throughout Europe, and we regularly advise companies, policymakers, regulators, and lawyers on any economic issue that may come in hand. And today I would like to discuss with you what we've did for EFCTC on the trade of HFCs. So here you see where we are. We are across Europe. So let's go to the content and take a look at what approach we took. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what we did is do an independent assessment of the trade flows of HFCs, and we did this both in terms of absolute volume and CO2 equivalent. And the table below represents the sources we used and the relevant period we looked at. Just for those who are not familiar with a lot of data sources, I will just walk through the main ones. So we have Eurostat data, which is data from all European countries combined by the European authorities, and provides good insights into European statistics on a number of different products. They use both the HS and the CN codes, and I will get back to what that means in practice. Then there's the Turkish Statistical Institute and Comtrade. So Comtrade is from the United Nations, and they collect data from 170 reporting countries or areas, and hence provides a very good database for with a big coverage throughout the world. And they use the HS as a level of data reporting. And then there's China export data, which is detailed information provided by Chinese sources, and they use the CN level. So why is it relevant? What level of data they use? The HS codes is a more aggregate level of data than the CN code. So using CN codes allows you to take a deeper look at more individual products and codes. So hence, where the data allows us, we prefer to use the CN code data over the HS code because it allows us to take a deeper look at what's in the data. What we did is analyze the data from 2016 until the end of 2018, and we will also analyze data for 2019 when it becomes available later this year, hopefully. So what we did, and then I'll move on to the next slide, is we did three things. First, we validated the reliability of the different data sources and compared the trend, especially between Comtrade and the China export data. Secondly, we looked at the imports reporting as leaving China and imports reporting as entering the EU. And third, we looked at the trade flows into the neighboring countries around the EU in 2016 and 18 and compared that with the trend. Why is this relevant? Because in that period in 2017, there was the last tightening of the F-gas regulation quota, as mentioned by Tim. So the slide you have in front of you now compares the first part of our analysis and compares the trend in Chinese export data. This is indexed data. The year 2010 is used as a base year, so it shows actual growth and not absolute numbers of volumes. And as you can see from both graphs, so the left-hand side is export from China into the EU, and the right-hand side is export from China into the neighboring countries. You see two lines, and both lines are quite the same, meaning that we feel confident to use the China export data instead of the Comtrade data because it allows a more detailed view of the data than using Comtrade, which only uses HS. The second part of our analysis is about the mismatch we discovered between export to the EU and import from China. And in principle, both trade flows should be the same. So imagine a ship full of F-gas, HFC gases going from China to EU. Then when the ship leaves China, the reported volume should be the same as the reported volume when entering the EU. However, in practice, we know there are a number of reasons why there is a difference. between those. And here it turns out that there is indeed a difference between both volumes at the beginning and at the end of the journey, you could say. And this is depicted in the graph. So the left-hand side, the dark blue, is the export from China, and the light blue is what enters the EU. And as you can see, the last volumes are lower than the first ones, and the line below shows the difference between those. Well, as I said, there could be reasons why this is the case. For instance, administration, just to name what. So what we did is check this with a comparison between the China data and the Turkish import data. And there was no similar mismatch between what's exiting China to go to Turkey and what's entering Turkey from China. And what's most interesting about this graph is that you can see in the line on the bottom hand of the graph that it's the difference is biggest between the two trade flows in 2018. Well, remember that the F-gas regulation quota was last tightened in 2017, and hence, if there would be an effect of the tightening of the quota, it would be visible in 2018. And as such, the discrepancy that we see here on the slides is consistent with the tightening of the quota in the EU, which might indicate illegal trade. So let's move on to the third part of the analysis we did, and that's the combination of the growth rate from exports from China into neighboring countries compared to into the European Union itself. And there we always used EU 27+1, and the +1 is for the UK. And as you can see from both lines here in the graph, the growth rate of the export from China into the neighboring countries is much bigger in 2018 than the growth rate into the EU itself. And also this is consistent with a potential growth in illegal trade into the EU, where potentially HFCs are transiting through neighboring countries. So to sum up, we see first that the trend of the Chinese export data is similar for the country data and the China export data, which allows us to take a more detailed look at the data by using the China export data. Secondly, there is a substantial discrepancy in the data, in the volumes of HFCs leaving China and entering the EU, comparing China export data with Eurostat. And thirdly, from 2017 to 2018, the imports into the neighboring countries was bigger than the imports in, so the growth rate was bigger than the import into European Union itself. And one explanation could be that the products are illegally imported into the EU market following the tightening of the F-gas regulation quota in 2018. And now I'll hand over to Murli.
Thank you, Nicole. It's great being here. So what I would like to do is take what Nicole just shared and translate that into what does it mean from an impact perspective, right? So there has been over the last couple of years independent companies, individual companies across the entire value chain that have noticed this issue on illegal HFC imports in the European Union. As a consequence, there has been and there continues to be investigation across multiple fronts, both in the EU, but also in the member states. However, the information and the study that Oxera has actually driven, what this has done on the EFCT's judgment is provide an accurate and complete picture. It is accurate because you've seen, what Nicole has shared, right? So it's a very rigorous methodology, followed through an external consultancy firm, which is used to doing, this type of studies as she was explaining earlier. So we believe it's pretty accurate, and it is complete because for the first time we basically are able to wrap up not only what is happening in the EU, but also look into the neighboring countries and as I'll explain to you just in a minute, to kind of see what those trends are and what that impact is. All in all, to say, we believe that both trends added EU, but also neighboring countries We estimate that the size of the problem is up to this 34 million tons of CO2 equivalent tons that you see up there, which said differently is a third of the size of the legal EU market, right? So, or if I would give you maybe a comparison, just from a practical perspective, this excess of HFCs that we believe is entering in the EU market is like putting 25 million new cars on the roads carrying in the old HFC refrigerant before MAC directive went actually enforced, right? So it's a big issue. It's a very, very bold issue. Let me try to give you a bit of flavor. If we go to the next chart, where we have a view from an EU perspective. So essentially here, Nicole did explain, the data sets that she has used, Comtrade, China data on one hand, a Eurostat comparison on the other. You did actually also see the numbers. On this space, essentially, the only other estimate that we had before the work that Oxera did was the estimation that EIA did, right? So if you recall, EIA had estimated the size of the issue in the EU was 16.3 million CO2 equivalent tons, right? So, this 19 million that you see up there is equivalent to the study that came out of EIA, and we believe is within the bracket, within the ballpark, and it's pretty consistent, essentially with what we're seeing in the marketplace. Maybe just one item to emphasize, that the role has from Oxera has been critical to be able to validate the China export data, right? So China export data is pretty granular, as what Nicole was explaining. It's it is provided at a CN level, which allows us pretty much to nail down precisely what is coming and what is the CO2 equivalency, right? So specific by grades, GWPs, following the IPCC guidelines are pretty clear. So it's relatively easy, to be able to build a CO2 view out of it, right? So that's how, we've landed on this number of 19 million CO2 tons. So this is the first leg. If you go to the next chart, we will see what is the second leg of the issue. So here, this one is referring to neighboring countries, and there is, we've taken a baseline as pointed out there, 2016. It is, I think it's factual to consider that the market dynamics in the neighboring countries are different to the EU. The neighboring countries are not governed by F-gas, and they are in a transition from previous generation fluorogases into HFCs, namely HCFCs to HFCs. So we have to take that market growth in consideration. However, you've seen what Nicole was pointing out. She was pointing out a 40% growth of 2018, versus a 2016 baseline. We believe that cannot be explained by market growth dynamics of domestic consumption increase in these markets. We believe, EFCTC believes, there is 15 million CO2 of excess discounted market growth. There's still a 15 million tons of CO2 equivalent tons in excess that we believe is flowing actually into the EU market. Now, the other interesting data item here is that this 2018 increase of imports from China is happening in 2018, which coincidentally matches with a year where there has been a substantial drop of quota under F-gas, right? So we believe that these indications, all these indications, data-driven indications, but also from a market perspective, and the evidence that private investigations are capturing, point in the same direction. That there's a flow of product excess imports coming from China into this territory, flowing through the back door into the European Union. So to bring basically all of this together, right? So 19 plus 15, that is where the 34 is coming from, and this number 34 is more than double to the number basically we were having available, all of us, up until now, which is the 16.3 that was provided by EIA last year, as I mentioned earlier. right? So we believe 34 million CO2 ton, or up to 34 millions of CO2 equivalent tons in excess entering in the European market is a very big fat number, equivalent to a third of the legal size of this market. Now, and Tim did mention this briefly, maybe a couple of words on what are the typical typologies that we're seeing in the background of this product actually making it to the market. We're seeing essentially three avenues. One is we're seeing transshipments. So these are T1s. We are seeing e-commerce platforms. So this is basically coming through internet. And we're seeing broad smuggle, right? So be it trucks crossing the border, be it a quota abuse, be it reporting done wrong, be it counterfeits, etc. Right? So that is the typical typologies that we are seeing with all of this. So what can be done to actually stop this? What can we do to actually work collectively to stop this? The first and the foremost is awareness. I would say that's the key piece that we need, and which is of this webinar, is part of driving this broad awareness across value chain, across regulators, across other stakeholders, and collaboration essentially across multiple stakeholders, which we believe are industry. We believe end users are part of that list. We believe European authorities and member state authorities are key stakeholders. In terms of specific measures that we need to actually get out there and work on, and you can see them up there. Harmonize and tighten enforcement measures, right? So in an F-gas quota system that is run at a European level, right? So just to remind everybody, F-gas quotas are granted to quota holders at a European level. The execution side of those quotas needs to be governed by the different member states. Hence, the harmonization and the tightening and the consistency of those enforcement measures across the EU 27 member states is absolutely critical. What does that mean? It means things like, for example, the penalties framework needs to be standard. We need to have one penalties framework that is valid across EU 27 member states. VAT controls need to be homogeneous. Targeted and spot checks on HFC supplies need to happen in a consistent manner. So that we believe that is a critical piece of execution. A second layer of work that can be done to stop this is around customs. Driving awareness at customs is absolutely critical, which is being done and we continue to do. Providing training to customs. These products are fairly technical products, as Tim was pointing out earlier. So to being able to understand, what these products are, in what forms they come in, is critical, and other details. So EFCTC is actually working with the EU Customs Group to build a training package and help relay those trainings out to customs officers in the different member states in local language. And finally, and probably most important, is furnishing customs with a efficient and practical IT tool, which is the single window project. We know this is something that is coming, and the Commission is actually planning of rolling this out. But this is absolutely critical piece, bringing in the single window capability as quickly as possible and as broadly as possible, meaning covering as many EU member states as possible. Thirdly, prohibiting supply and use of non-refillables. So there has been multiple pieces of regulations prohibiting the use of non-refillables, but all of us have seen articles in the media covering different seizures in different places across the European Union of these disposables, right? So an effective prohibition, an effective ban is really required. And finally, reporting illegal activity, right? So allowing for channels for whistleblowing activity is absolutely critical. And along these lines, the EFCTC has pulled this action line last year with tremendous amount of success, which is actually feeding the investigation efforts that Kroll is actually doing in the field and in the ground. In closing, with the F-gas quota taking another phase down comes January 1, 2021, and another bold phase down. It is absolutely critical that we get illicit trade under control, that we apply and get in motion all these different actions, that we get this broad coordination, as I was pointing out earlier, across different stakeholders, so that collectively we can actually stop illicit trade. I think we can go back to you now, Renee, for Q&A.
Thank you, Murli. Yes, well, we have 143 people online. It's a great event. We got a number of questions already coming up. Let me see. We have the question from Fiona Walravens from the EIA, asking, did you compare Eurostat data looking at HFC imports with data on HFCs imports reported to the F-gas registry? Tim, can I give that one to you?
Yes, and I'll defer to Murli as well. So Oxera did not, but the European Commission commissioned a study themselves, and they compare the Eurostat data with the data reported in the F-gas registry, and they didn't find any substantial discrepancy. Now, that's not surprising, because people who are reporting to the F-gas registry are actually listed in the registry. They hold quota, and they do report. They're actually placing on the markets of HFCs. Organized crime does not report to the F-gas registry, does not report to the European Commission, and therefore those data are basically not incorporated in both the EEA data, nor for a very large extent in the Eurostat data. That's the reason. I'll defer to Murli for further elaboration.
Yeah, Tim, maybe just to build on what you're saying here, I fully agree with you. Traces of illegal transactions you can hardly find in legal systems, right? So I think that is a little bit the background here. And it is no different to what Nicole was pointing out earlier on. Outflows from China are substantially higher than the inflows that are reflected, within Eurostat, right? So, it is, you're not going to find, traces of illegal transactions in official records, in official books, right? Because that's precisely what illegal is about, is transactions through the back door, right? So, just fully concur with what you're saying.
Okay. Then there is a question from Ens. Let me see. The Robert Hutchins refers to a council meeting of the European Commission's F-gas consultation forum that says, given that lower level of prices was observed at the end of 2019, the lower incentive for illegal trade is currently lower. At the same time as enforcement, including the severity of penalties, is being strengthened, it is likely that the relevance of such activities will be declining. And he is asking Mr. Rosenbaum's opinion on this. Let me first of all remind you, as a CEFIC responsible, that talking about prices is not permitted here. So, but Nicole, I give you the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for your question, Robert. We didn't look at the prices of the volumes that were analyzed, so we did not see any price decrease or increase whatsoever, simply because we didn't look at it. But I can imagine that importing against, so also illegal importing against lower prices might still be attractive if what we economists call the counterfactual is less attractive, so selling it to another country outside the EU. If the price level with the EU and outside the EU is different, then even with lower prices in the EU, it might still be attractive. And obviously, if penalties are increased and also the enforcement is increased, this might have a deterrent working on illegal trade. But again, that's not something we looked into.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Then we have a question from Neil Everett, asking, it has been quite clear that a lot of refrigerant on the market is in illegal non-refillable cylinders. Is there any evidence that this product is being brought in legally, in inverted commas, by quota license holders? If so, is there no way for the EU or customs to control this? Murli, can I give this one to you?
Yeah, thanks, Rene. Good question. Along the lines of the typologies that I shared earlier, the 3 types of typologies, there is and continues to be investigation work. Kroll, a private investigation company, has been brought in by EFCTC last year to precisely look into the detailed transactions, right? Of which our action line has been one conduit of intelligence into Kroll. What I can share is basically 2 specific data points. One is the number of cases that have come to the action line. March 2019 through the end of 2019, we've had 228 cases of detailed cases that were sent for Kroll for investigation. There has been 444 takedowns across 15 e-commerce platforms, 444 requests of takedowns across 15 e-commerce platforms. Kroll, in their work of investigation, have pulled evidence on 3,000 tons of product coming illegally into the EU, which translates into 4.7 million CO2 equivalent tons. We believe this is the tip of the iceberg of what we're seeing, and as we continue investigation, as Kroll continues that investigation, further evidence is going to pile up. Given the sensitivity of some of these cases, it is hard for us to share more. Certainly the details of these cases sit with Kroll and the enforcement agencies. We don't get to see the detailed cases. This is discussed with certain, obviously, as you can understand, with confidentiality, and it is only as these cases get finalized and closed, they get actually publicized. But yes, the response to Neil's question is there is sizable evidence that is building in the background, and we cannot comment details. Kroll working together with Olaf, but also enforcement agencies across different member states in the EU are driving these investigations and this intelligence forward to try and capitalize as max as possible.
Okay, thank you, Murli. Next question is, do you have import data from China for 2019 and 2020? In the slide only include until 2018. Nicole, can you take up that question, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you for that question. So we have country data for parts of 2019 and the same for Eurostat. However, the volumes of HFCs have quite a high seasonal effect. So for us, it didn't make sense to report any quarters instead of a full year. So what we'll do is when the whole year for 2019 is complete, and now we're waiting on China to deliver its data to Comtrade, we will rerun the analysis and look what changed potentially when adding a full year.
Then there's a question from the Confederación Nacional de Instaladores, CNI. Countries from outside the EU that send gas to Spain, in addition to China and Morocco or Algeria, are India and Russia in large quantities. These shipments can often pass through intermediate countries listed as their origin. It would be interesting to verify this information through Eurostat data if possible. Tim, can you take that question?
I'll take a first cut. Thank you for the question. This is very complex, but essentially we know that the majority of production of HFCs originates in China. So whether they are channeled through other countries, for example, Russia, or any other country neighboring the European Union, most certainly those products have been shipped originally from China. India is an exception. India does have some level of HFC production. We've had a look at it, and we haven't seen great evidence, but that may be the case. So it's not an easy question to answer. Certainly, if they are covered by the official Eurostat statistics, that would be possible. But most likely, those shipments are under so-called transit arrangements, and then they do not get reported to Eurostat, and therefore they are not covered by the Eurostat statistics. I know this is not a very good answer, but this is the best we can do. What we have tried to do is, with Oxera, to identify other databases, such as Russia and some of the other countries, to again validate the export data from China and India, but that has been proven impossible. But possibly Nicole can say a bit more about that.
Yes, thank you, Tim. I fully agree with your comments, and as described in the slides, we did check on Turkish data, which was quite reliable. We also looked at Russian data, and I recall that the data wasn't complete in the sense that it didn't cover all HFC codes. So we ended up not using it in our analysis.
Okay, then we have a question on labeling and products and equipment information. During customs clearance procedure, do the big gas containers, the size of 1,000 kilo, need to be already labeled with all the data prescribed in Article 12 of Regulation 517/2014, or this can be done in a later stage in importers' premises after being put in smaller containers? Morley, is that one for you?
Yeah, Renee, this is probably better for Tim.
Okay. Tim?
Thank you, Burley. So essentially, the requirement under Article 12 is for any product that's being placed on the EU market. So, for example, if a company is importing the material and bringing it into, for example, its warehouse for customs clearance, then actually that can be done. So the labeling can be applied at the point where the customs declaration is made. In practice, what we as producers do is basically make sure that the labeling is already present on the packaging at the moment of import when the product is arriving in the European market. It is an interesting question, but the more interesting question is whether the illegal operators are abiding by that Article 12 of the EU F-gas regulation, if they are fully ignoring the quota arrangements under the F-gas regulation. But you're absolutely right. So, for example, in the case of non-refillable cylinders, the disposable cylinders that are bought on the internet, quite often those cylinders do not meet the F-gas regulation labeling requirements. So that not only are they illegal from a point of view that they cannot be placed on the EU market because they're not refillable, but they do not meet the labeling requirements. Absolutely right.
Then I have a question for Nicole. Could you please mention which NC the survey are including?
Yes, I can. I realize it's not on the slide. Let me check whether it's not, otherwise I have to open a different one. I think it's a list of like 10. Hang on. Can we maybe pause that question because I want to be sure before I mention the wrong countries?
Can I, essentially, I will not provide the very precise numbers, but essentially the CN codes always start with 2903, and then for the blends, it's, help me, 3478 if I'm not mistaken. But we'll get back to you. It will be on our website.
By the way, just for everybody, the slides will be made available to all the participants after the webinar. And there's a question. I think that one, Tim, I will pass to you. It's 34 million tons of CO2 is around 17,000 physical tons of HFCs, that is 1,000 ISO containers or over 1,000,000 15-kilogram cylinders. How does that get into the supply chain in the EU? Are you suggesting that major repackers or OEMs are buying illegal products?
So essentially, this is always some speculation. If I look at 23 million tons, 43 million tons, to me that would be roughly 20,000 tons of material. So 17,000 or 20,000. That's the ballpark. What I'm suggesting is that a lot of this material is being brought into the market using basically through internet sales, very substantial. And secondly, I'm not suggesting anyone, basically when we deal with OEMs, when we deal with the large distributors, they have a duty of care. So, and that's what I said in my introductory remarks, a lot of this material is actually bypassing the traditional supply chain. That's why the small and medium-sized enterprises are suffering, because they see a very substantial drop in their sales. They see, I've talked to distributors individually who said, listen, I've lost 80% of my market in the past 3 months. So they're bypassing the traditional supply chain. I'm not suggesting that any of the well-reputed distributors, certainly not OEMs, are purchasing illegal material or knowingly purchasing illegal material.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Next question from Nino Nenchev. Does the analysis take into account the possibility to legally import the materials necessary to illegally produce HFCs within the EU? Nicole?
Yes, thank you. No, it doesn't. We only looked at the HS and CN codes for HFC specifically, and not any materials that could be related to it.
Nicole, also with regard to a previous question on the countries, do you want to complement your earlier answer?
Sure. I think it's also sent out in the chat window, but the neighboring countries are Albania, Armenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, Russian Federation, Serbia, Switzerland, Turkey and Ukraine. So quite a number.
All right.
Rene, maybe just to build on Nicole's answer to Nino on this question on if the analysis takes into account the possibility to legally import materials to then make illegally produced HFCs within the EU. Well, you know, even though, as Nicole said, this is not necessarily something that we have considered in the study to come up to the 34 million, but this can happen, right? So, you know, anybody having quota can import legally components and then blend products that are have intellectual property behind, etc. That, you know, or that may be banned, etc. Right? It can be. It can eventually that can be done. Anybody can do that, right? So, however, in the work we have done, it's not the analysis angle that we have given to the work.
Then I have a question what was mentioned by Nicole. I don't know who can best answer it, but Nicole mentioned that illegal trade is one explanation for the data inconsistencies. Is this the most likely explanation, or are there other possibilities? Coming from Matthew Kopeski.
Yeah, so I'll pick up that, Rene, if that's okay. You know, from an EFCTC perspective, we believe this is the most likely hypothesis. That the most likely hypothesis is this excess HFCs getting to the EU market is actually driven by illicit trade of HFCs within the EU. We don't believe any other hypothesis is as large as this one. Now, you know, when we look at these numbers and, you know, when we throw in, you know, up to 34 million CO2 equivalent tons, all of us need to consider this is illegal, right? So it is very difficult to trace and nail down exactly how much is the amount. However, we believe, you know, it gives a good bracket to work. It gives us a very good indication. It's pretty accurate towards what we're indicating, right? So it is not a illegal trade is not a mathematical formula, right? So that you add up 2 + 2 and get to 4, and it's exactly 4. This is we need to take it a little bit more with a little bit more subtlety, right? But coming back to the specific question, yes, we believe that the predominant hypothesis is that these are illegal imports within the EU.
Okay, we have a next question. That's regarding end users. That's how do you suggest end users should distinguish between legal and illegal HFCs? Tim, can you expand on that?
Yes. The first answer is actually end users rarely purchase those HFCs. What they purchase is a complete surface package. So, for example, if you have your car serviced, your car air conditioning system serviced, you do not purchase the HFC. You purchase the full package. Similarly, if you're a butcher and you have a freezing cell in your shop, what you purchase is a full service package from your contractor. So the end users have essentially are not purchasing HFCs. The end users usually are the contractors, the garagists, etc., etc. Now, how can they identify whether product is suspect, let's put it this way, and possibly illegal, potentially illegal? Well, first of all, if it's offered in non-refillable containers, disposables as we call them, then it's illegal. So that's easy. So a lot of material that's being offered on e-commerce platforms are by definition illegal. That's why we've been so successful in taking those offerings down with the e-commerce platforms. That's one. Secondly, if somebody comes knocking on your door and offers you HFCs cash in hand, so no tracing of money paid, etc., etc., then most likely that is illegal material. We've seen examples of people knocking on doors of small workshops all over Europe, little grey vans, and say, listen, I've got the HFCs, are you interested in buying it? So most likely those are illegal. Thirdly, if the price is too good to be true, then most likely it is too good to be true, and it is illegal. Fourth, if people offer and say, listen, here's the material, but do not offer basically a return cylinder, do not request a deposit on the cylinder, then essentially sell the product, including the cylinder, sometimes very large cylinders like ton tanks, then most likely that product is illegal. Fourthly, there are well-established distributors in the market. All of the EFCTC members and some of the others are listed, they are known. So if you purchase from an authorized supplier, then most likely you can be confident that the material is legal. So there's many ways of discovering this, and again, there's never 100% certainty, but if people are offering, especially cash offers, and we've seen reports of those cash offers all over Europe, then clearly that's illegal. Thank you.
Okay, Tim, then we have a next one. Which are the main HFCs imported illegally? The question the person asking is I suppose it's R134A, but what about the others? I don't know, Merle, maybe complemented by Nicole, but
yeah, so Nicole, just maybe add extra data. Essentially, 134A is the largest, but we have evidence on 410A. Also have evidence on 404A. Those are the three largest, and to a lesser extent, some other smaller grades. Nicole, anything else to add?
No, I think that's correct. That's consistent with what we found.
Yep.
Then there's a question: are any counterfeit refrigerants coming into Europe from the south? For example, Africa. Nicole, is there any indication to check import data from Africa?
We didn't. We checked at which country in the EU they entered, but I'm sure we also looked at from where they originated from, but I don't know that right now. So I can check that and come back to Moot is the one who asked the question.
So there's a very important distinction. So counterfeit has to do with intellectual property.
Yep.
So this is where, and this is a concern to all the major players, obviously. So this is where people are placing product in the market, pretending it to be Honeywell product, or pretending it to be Chemours product, or pretending it to be Arkema product, whoever. Basically, they're abusing the brand name, or they are infringing specific intellectual property on the manufacturing process or the use applications. So that is different. It's still illegal, but possibly that's apart from flouting or not obeying the quota rules. That's more associated with intellectual property. There, as companies, we have far greater means to actually pursue this directly, because people are infringing intellectual property, and the intellectual property enforcement in Europe is pretty good.
Are the customs authorities aware of this issue? Tim?
The illegal trade? Yes,
yeah,
sir.
the counterfeit.
No. So usually, what we do as companies, and certainly Honeywell does, is we will work with customs authorities, and there's several cases of where customs authorities have confiscated counterfeit material.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just maybe Rene add, to what Tim is saying, which is absolutely correct. Counterfeits is not necessarily related to illicit trade or legal trade, and it has happened, even long before, we've had illicit trade on HFCs, right? So there, obviously, customs are pretty much enforced. The different members of EFCTC, would work with their legal teams, with their internal teams, with customs, and other enforcement bodies out in the marketplace. So yes, however, it's, as Tim said, it is disconnected with illegal. It's a different issue.
Then there's a reference to the report. The report talks about potential illegal trade. And do you also have hard evidence of illegal HFC trade? Merle, I think, best placed.
Yeah, so I did refer to this earlier, and the answer is yes, absolutely yes, and that is essentially the role of private investigation company Kroll. That's why we brought these guys on board, a professional investigation company that works very closely with enforcement bodies, both at an EU level, but also at a member state level, where there is detailed exchange of intelligence, right? So I think here, given the sensitivity of the data, that exchange between private investigation Kroll and enforcement bodies, goes, completely leaves the member companies of EFCTC outside. But yes, there is evidence, and this is a bit kind of what I said earlier, is Kroll in the work they've been doing for the last year or so have clear documented evidence of up to 3,000 tons, metric tons of product, which is equivalent to 4.7 million CO2 equivalent tons, that they're working with authorities, where they have provided specific detailed investigation dossiers to actually hub the work of the enforcement bodies in the member states, so that they can actually go and enforce the regulation in their respective countries, right? So the answer is absolutely yes. There is strong evidence that what we are saying, that what the analytics that Oxera has done, and what we shared earlier, it is backed by real case situations in the marketplace, right? So I would say this is what we've seen so far is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more in the background, but you can understand the complexity of some of these things. It's very convoluted, documentation. So whoever has a criminal mind and wants to do illegal trade, make sure that they leave as minimum traces as possible and convolute documentation, etc. Right. So there's substantial work of investigation that has happened, and that continues to happen, and a strong connectivity with enforcement bodies.
Okay, Morley, thanks. There's a question from Michael Sorensen. Is there any estimation of the size of the legal import in small amounts outside the quota system? Tim, can I pass that one to you?
Yeah, so the short answer is to import legally outside the quota, because there's a de minimis threshold of 100 tons CO2 equivalent. But essentially, the trouble people need to make to actually get that product and import the product from outside the EU is pretty substantial. So we've looked at it, and clearly we don't believe it's very substantial, but that's something that needs further investigation. But we're really focusing on the large quantities. So what we see is more often is essentially that you see large containers being broken up in neighboring countries, and then small vans being filled with a few of those cylinders crossing the border, actually disposable, non-refillable cylinders, which is prohibited under a different rule under the F-gas regulation. So those individual crossings possibly are under the threshold, but the point is those vans are crossing the border not once, but several times a year. And then if you just aggregate it, then people are breaking the law.
Okay, there's a reaction from Neil Everett, Tim, to your earlier answer on counterfeit. Neil is saying counterfeit is also refrigerant, for instance, claiming to be, say, R134A, but actually made up of other potentially dangerous components. I don't know whether you want to react or whether just take the, let's say, the comment.
Yeah, no, so Neil, counterfeit traditionally refers to IP infringement. What you're referring to, I wouldn't refer to as counterfeit. Basically, I would call this just mislabeling and misrepresenting, which is very serious and certainly something that needs to be pursued. What we more often see is actually that people basically to disguise the shipments. We've seen several shipments being classified as, for example, propane, but in fact the cylinders contain even HCFC R22 or 134A when checked. But I acknowledge and certainly basically misrepresenting the contents of a cylinder is very serious and needs to be pursued, possibly not just under the EU F-gas regulation, but under the European regulations on classification, labeling and packaging of dangerous substances. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Tim. Now let's see, do we have any further other questions? Don't see any immediately. That was from Tim. Yeah. To date, that's another question from Villanueva from EIA. To date, many of the penalties we have seen relating to HFC smuggling in the EU have been low compared to the profits involved. How can we help increase awareness of the importance of meaningful penalties at the national level to deter chemicals? That's for Tim, I guess.
I feel sorry for Merle. I think he can reply as well. So I'll give a first go, but then Merle, please chip in. You're absolutely right. So currently, in many countries, the level of penalties are essentially what people consider the cost of doing business. They just pay the penalty and get away with it. So how you can help raise awareness is actually, that's why we have this seminar. That's why EFCTC is organizing workshops with frontline enforcement officers to help them understand, but also if you as NGO with great credibility call on the member states to increase their penalties to levels that are truly deterrent, that would be very helpful. Merle?
Yeah, maybe to build on that, Tim, I think is a very good question. and one that EFCTC has processed. So last year, among the different actions that EFCTC has taken, we did charter a study on specific countries with a law firm, with an external law firm, to understand what was the framework of penalties. Right. So, and as you're rightfully pointing out, penalties are typically unexisting or low. And the other thing that came across is the landscape was very different from one country to another. This has been, obviously we're raising it here. It's, we've mentioned this on this webinar multiple times. We have taken that study and shared it with the Commission also, and flagged it to them. It's like, hey, here, this is a landscape. Here's what the study has given us. Tell us how can we help, right? So which we as EFCTC are moving forward in the advocacy efforts we do in the different member states, as well as what we do at a European Union level, and bringing it forward. But I think, the fact that we bring it here, and as Tim is pointing out, is, getting others, like, for example, NGOs, driving the same message can help us collectively, kind of, move the needle a lot faster.
Thanks, Murli. Then we have a question, I think again, maybe between Murli and Nicole, which is the border where they are entering more illegal product. Nicole,
yeah,
I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, I mean, obviously we don't know which border that is because the data doesn't show illegal trade, as illegal trade isn't reported. But what we did look at is what were the 4 biggest importers among the neighboring countries from Chinese and US exports. And those 4 countries are Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and Albania. Well, there could be a number of reasons why the growth in those countries is so increasing. For instance, new factories, or just to name a few. But that's as far as we can see in the data, and which relates to your question.
Yeah, and maybe, Nicole, if you allow me, maybe just to build on that, the key geographies from an EU perspective, where we see probably a higher level of illegal or illicit imports, is firstly in the Balkans, where we are seeing unusual activity, and that's just the data set analysis, China exports, Eurostat. That's kind of what that gives us. The second place where we are seeing unusual level of activity is in the Baltics area. And the third area of unusual activity is Central Eastern Europe. So those are, without wanting to single out specific countries, because the data, maybe circumstantial or misleading, but those are, we believe, those are the key areas. And in our discussions also with private investigator and enforcement authorities, that's where we are seeing a higher level of pressure versus other places. Doesn't mean that you're not going to find pressure of illicit imports in other spots, but those are probably the ones we would, I would flag as places where there is probably a substantially higher level of illegal imports versus other places.
There's also one that builds on that. How could we cope with cases that product is imported illegally in one European country and then is sold to another European country? Typically, the second transaction can be considered legal, but it is not. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the notion of F-gas is a EU 27 notion, right? So when a quota holder is granted quota, it is a quota applicable to EU 27. The enforcement of that quota happens at a member state level, right? So the execution, where the rubber meets the road, that execution piece happens at customs at a member state. Hence the comments I was making earlier, a common platform, a common IT platform where customs across EU 27 member states are connected, where EU customs in a given member state can see what is the status of quota placed on the market by a given incumbent, by a given quota holder, is absolutely capital. It is something that does not exist today. It's something that, that connectivity is not there today. Essentially, today customs across EU27 have access to the registry where they see what incumbents hold quota, but the placing on the market balance is not captured there, as you know, right? So it's only captured after the fact, right? When the reporting is done in the following year, right? So this single window mechanism is going to be, we understand, is going to be the tool, the IT tool. It is absolutely critical. Two things: getting this tool as quickly as possible implemented, one, and the second is having as many countries as possible going live with it as soon as possible, right? So, it's my understanding that there's going to be a phased approach, and different countries are going to go in different waves of implementation of the single window. The point we're making is it is absolutely critical to have all EU27 member states in the same platform, because that's what's going to make the tool effective and efficient, and finally is going to help us stop this illicit trade, or help at least control it in a much more effective manner versus what we are doing currently.
Following question is that a lot of smuggled refrigerants are coming from non-EU border countries, and this continues unabated. These criminal organizations need to be caught and prosecuted. What are the EU authorities doing about this? Tim, you're the best place to answer this one.
Well, here's first of all, disclaimer: I'm not an EU authority, so I can't reply on their behalf.
Maybe do you think that the EU authorities are, let's say, aware enough of the issue? And
they are
acting.
So part of our outreach really has been to, for example, OLAF, which is the Serious Fraud Office within the European Union. They did get a specific mandate to work on this file. They're working very closely with Kroll, and they are taking this very seriously. So some of the seizures, some of the confiscations and arrests that you've seen are the direct result of the cooperation between OLAF, Kroll, and the national enforcement authorities. So certainly things are moving. But first of all, there's an asymmetry in enforcement, in the sense that actually criminal organizations are extremely agile. They can respond very quickly by shifting from one country to another, whereas building a criminal case for a prosecutor to actually take action takes months. So there is clearly an asymmetry. The minute people see, oh, there's a threat in country A, I can move my business to another country. So that's one. The second element is that quite often, as I referred to in my introductory remarks, this is a complex sort of organization. The people you catch are often the middlemen. The small drivers in the small vans that you see everywhere in Europe, who are basically driving around with a few $100s or a few €100 worth of material. They will get arrested, they will lose their business, but the people behind are behind borders. And so what you then need is actually cooperation between the European Union and some of the neighboring countries. Now, that is not very easy, that's complex again, and you need to have a pretty good case. One of the things that we have pursued with Kroll is actually something, just follow the money. Because in the end, that's where you can hit people, if you hit them in the pockets. That's a very delicate operation. I can't say too much about it, but you understand, in reply to your question, we certainly agree that it must be prosecuted. Our strategy is really based on two elements. First of all, disrupt the supply, which is basically make sure that the criminal organizations are facing lots of barriers. And the other one is actually stop demand. And that's a very important element of our campaign as well. In the end, we should be talking to contractors, not the end users, but people who are purchasing at the end of the supply chain, the material. And call on their sense of duty that actually they need to make sure that they purchase products from legitimate sources. I know it's an incomplete answer, but that's as good as I can do. Thank you.
Yeah, Tim, I have another one probably for you or Merle. Question is whether you did analysis of the product quality of illegally imported products, and if yes, what was the result of that? Tim or Merle or both?
Merle?
Tim, no, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So some products have been analyzed. Actually, in the course of prosecution, actually related to the previous question, the first thing that actually prosecutors will have to do is prove that material is an HFC. So yes, in many cases where material has been confiscated, we've done the analysis, and quite often the product meets the official standards. That's not surprising. Because they are manufactured in large-scale factories in China, and in the end the product meets the specifications. The only thing is it's not covered by quota. It's not, so we don't think it's a big quality issue. There could be quality issues, but we haven't seen them yet.
Yeah, it could be isolated, Tim. Maybe just to build on what you're saying, there could be some isolated cases, but broadly speaking, I think this is what Tim is saying. Is like, what we've come across is. What you see is what you get, right? So it's basically what is being sold is basically what's in there. So quality issues have been minimal, or if any at all.
Someone is asking, can you say more about the action line published on the EFCTC website? Merle?
Yeah. So the action line, the purpose of the action line, we brought this to life at the time we brought Kroll in. An action line actually is operational in multiple languages, and we are targeting now to even expand beyond the languages that we already have to other languages to make sure in the hot areas that I mentioned earlier, Balkans, Baltics, etc., that we do cover local language to ease the reporting. So essentially, it's confidential. So whatever somebody reports in there goes straight into Kroll and goes into their investigation database, and they would start investigation. Obviously, they cross the data with some of the other software that they have. There is standing exchange of intelligence between Kroll and particular specific enforcement authorities. Right, so essentially what we report, and we reported recently, the number of cases that we got in 2019. The work continues, even though we're not reporting maybe on a monthly or a quarterly basis, but the work actually moves forward. And to the point Tim was making earlier, I think this is really important, right? Because it's probably not being seen, but I think it's important that everybody understands. A lot of the enforcement cases that have been published in media, a lot of them have in the foundation is the background work is the work that actually Kroll is being doing together with Olaf and others, right? So it's only when it gets to fruition that all of us actually get to see it. But that is the foundation of the work. The action line is on the EFCTC website. It is totally, absolutely confidential in there. So EFCTC members, we don't get copies of it. As I said earlier, it goes straight into Kroll, right? So and I encourage people to use it. We've been made aware also with some of interactions with member states that some member states have their own action lines for illegal cases, not specifically only to HFCs, but broad illegal transaction cases, right? So I do encourage people to get in there. It is not just reporting. There is effective action happening in the background.
Then I have a difficult question here. I don't know whether I don't think it's possible for us to give an answer, but the question is, how are the networks of illegal HFC imports related to smuggling of other regulated or banned goods?
What I would say, Rene, is it's a difficult question. I wish I knew. I wish, I wish we knew exactly and could actually dot the I's and cross the T's and say here's and finger point them, because it would make a lot easier the work of the authorities, right? So I think Tim did actually mention some of the red flags that everybody should be watching, be it end user, be it contractor, no matter where you are in the value chain. There are a number of red flags out there that are suspicious cases, and I would say is watch those and basically report those on the action line. And that's as much. I don't know, Tim, anything else to add?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the next question is. Seems to me that there is an obvious answer there, but what should be done with confiscated illegal HFCs? Can we foresee a mechanism where confiscated HFCs are legally marketed instead of destruction?
Shall I take that?
Yeah, take it on.
So essentially, this relates to the question of the quality of the product. If the product is good, then indeed it would seem to run against the principle of a circular economy and an efficient economy to destroy the material. So even from a legal point of view, destruction may be the option that's required under law. We do agree that basically if there is a mechanism to place them on the market using legitimate quota, then that would be preferable. That involves a lot of work. But the answer is, yeah, if the quality is acceptable, then conceivably that product could be brought on the market by legitimate quota holders. Yes.
I have a question for Nicole, I suppose. I don't see Hungary listed with the named countries above, but believe Hungary plays a role, at least as a transit point. Any other issues in Hungary?
Yes, thank you. We looked into Hungary as it being a member state in the EU, so that's why it's not listed on the list of neighboring countries. But the volume in trade flows for intra-EU trade, so trade within the European Union, only increased for 6% for Hungary, and it's not a major country in the sense of volume shipped through. So no issues from my side besides that. Not sure whether you were interested in specific issues.
Yeah, I could say something more with it. Actually, EFCTC has been cooperating with the Hungarian officials on the subject, right. And transit has been identified as a potential issue. But again, if it's in transit, product is in transit, then it's not illegal. Yeah. It's the moment when it's placed on the market. So when basically people deviate from the transit course. But we were very encouraged in Hungary because Hungary has a very good electronic tracing system for what they call sensitive goods. And there is, as I understand, an initiative that will come to fruition later in the year, where HFCs will be added to the list of sensitive goods, where electronic monitoring can happen at transportation level, at truck level.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe if you allow me, Rene, just to build on that. The T1 mechanism is a tricky mechanism. It is because it's in transit, and as Tim is pointing out, while it's in transit, it's not illegal. It is only when it's placed on the market that eventually it may become illegal. But some of the evidence that Kroll has actually pulled, there have been cases whereas electronically in some member states the transactions are controlled. There have been cases where a truck is bound on a transit procedure to leave a given country. The truck is stopped at customs and opened, and it was empty, right? So the product actually stayed behind in the country where it actually entered in the EU as transit, right? So the transit procedure has a number of loopholes that actually need to get sorted out, right? So and I believe this is Claire and the European authorities are aware. Olaf is aware. DG Klima is aware of it, right? So the in transit it's beyond just HFCs, right? We're specifically talking here HFCs, but it requires a thought on to see how it gets re-engineered so that it can be adapted to the needs of F-gas.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the webinar. I have one other question here. Do you have a deadline date to reduce the illegal market in next months or years? To be realistic, because I'm thinking that all of these measures will be ready in next years because we depend on our countries. Tim, can you take that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and there is no. Yes, we do have a deadline, but criminal organizations don't meet our deadline, so that's the easy thing. But first of all, this year is a year of what I would call the truth. So because next year the reduction versus the baseline is 55%, so we go from -37 versus baseline to -55. If we can't get our arms around the issue this year, then next year I fear we see a surge in illegal transactions again. We depend on the individual countries. Part of this exercise is actually to raise the awareness. EFCTC slightly basically with running against the COVID virus, the corona virus. We will start a very intensive campaign with the national authorities, with the enforcement agencies, with basically dedicated workshops where we can actually help them identify illegal material and help them to come up with concrete action to stop illegal trade in HFCs. So essentially for our business, this year is the year of the truth. If we can't manage it this year, then the floodgates will open again next year. So we better get our act together now. And again, what I said is it's disrupting the supply, but it's also making sure that demand is responsible. That means that we need to convince people in the marketplace that they have a duty of care as well. They need to check whether the material is legal or not. A good example is Germany. Germany is working on a decree that actually will facilitate the tracking and tracing of the flows of HFCs in the territory of Germany. And we hope that will be a good example for other member states to emulate. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks for that, Tim. So that was the last question. I'd like to remind everybody of two things. To say the slides will be made available, as I mentioned earlier, and also this webinar is being recorded. So let's say availability to review it later again. I would like to conclude giving the speakers a short round of final comments. Nicole, may I start with you, ladies first?
Thank you. I enjoyed the discussions and the many questions. It shows that this is really a topic that's at the heart of many people, and we were just happy to hopefully have contributed on a bit of transparency and the data in the further journey of this. Thank you.
Tim?
Thank you, René, first of all, for moderating this session. I think you need to be recognized for that as well. And then we look forward to working with Nicole's team again, because we're not finished. So as somebody noticed, we only have data for 2018. We hope to be presenting our data for 2019, somewhere in the September timeframe. And so watch this site. There will be more information coming, and I would really express my great appreciation for all of you to sit in during this webinar for an hour and a half. Thank you.
Marley?
Yeah, to thank the audience, René. It's great to be able to have this audience, and with the quality questions we've been asked. Well, there's one thing for me that is really important is, and I've mentioned it in my presentation, is this is a complex issue that requires support across many stakeholders, And this is a pledge to many of the audience and others to kind of drive this collective work so that we can put in the fixes that we mentioned earlier. It is fixable. The issue is large. The fixes are possible. We've talked about what are the immediate fixes. I mean, this is not walking on water in my mind. I believe there has to be a strong will. There has to be a strong commitment to make it work. We believe we can make it work, and EFCTC certainly is supporting and would like to be part of that solution. And thank you, Renee, for hosting the call. Appreciate your help also.
It was my pleasure to do this, and yeah, I'd like to thank you as the speakers and also the participants for very active participation. I think this has been a very lively webinar with many good questions. So I hope it leads to fruitful follow-up. Thank everybody and have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.